The scent of freshly baked bread filled the air as the sun cast a golden glow over the small bakery on the corner of a quiet street. Inside, flour dust floated in the light, and the rhythmic sound of kneading dough echoed through the cozy space. This was more than just a bakery. For many in the neighborhood, it was a place of comfort, warmth, and kindness. Emma, the young baker, wiped her hands on her apron, her face glowing with quiet determination. She had inherited this bakery from her late grandmother, a woman who had taught her not just the art of baking, but the value of generosity. Every morning, Emma would wake before dawn, her hands working tirelessly to shape loaves, pastries, and rolls. But what made her bakery truly special wasn't just the delicious bread. It was her heart. For as long as she could remember, Emma had made it a tradition to set aside a portion of her baked goods for those in need. Some days, an elderly man with a tattered coat would shuffle in, his hands trembling as he accepted a warm loaf. Other times, a single mother with tired eyes would come in with her young child, whispering words of gratitude as Emma handed them a bag of fresh rolls. No one who was hungry ever left empty-handed. Despite struggling to keep the bakery running, Emma never turned anyone away. She barely made enough to cover the bills, but she always found a way to stretch her resources. Some of her paying customers would leave extra money, knowing it would go toward feeding someone in need. Others would bring in supplies when they could, touched by Emma's selflessness. Still, there were nights when she sat alone at the wooden counter, running her fingers through her hair, wondering if she could keep this up. Then, one chilly evening, as she was closing up, a man walked into the bakery. He wasn't like her usual customers. He didn't wear worn-out clothes, and there was something about the way he carried himself that made Emma pause. He was tall, dressed in a dark coat, with a quiet presence that filled the small shop. His eyes, sharp yet unreadable, studied the loaves displayed on the counter. "Can I help you?" Emma asked, her voice gentle yet curious. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked around the bakery, as if taking in every detail. The neatly arranged baskets of bread, the small chalkboard sign that read, "Take what you need, pay what you can," and the nearly empty shelves from a long day of customers. Finally he spoke. "You give bread away for free?" Emma hesitated, not because she was ashamed, but because she wasn't sure how he meant the question. Some people admired her kindness, while others thought it was foolish. She met his gaze and nodded. "Yes, to those who need it." The man studied her for a moment, his face unreadable. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a crisp bill. Without another word, he placed it on the counter. Emma's eyes widened. It was far more than the price of a loaf, more than what most customers paid in a week. "You don't have to do that," she said, glancing up at him. Unsure of his intentions, he simply nodded toward the bread. "Give me whatever this is worth." Emma hesitated before carefully picking up a warm loaf and placing it in a paper bag. As she handed it to him, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something different about this man. He wasn't just here for the bread. He took the bag, but didn't leave right away. Instead, he lingered, his eyes settling on the old framed photograph hanging behind the counter. It was a picture of Emma as a little girl, standing beside her grandmother, both of them beaming in front of the bakery. After a long silence, the man spoke again, his voice softer this time. "You remind me of someone." Emma frowned slightly. "Who?" The man didn't answer. He simply nodded once, almost as if confirming something to himself, then turned and walked toward the door. The bell jingled as he stepped out into the cold night, disappearing into the shadows of the quiet street. Emma stood there, staring after him, her heart pounding for reasons she couldn't quite explain. Something about that encounter unsettled her, left her with more questions than answers. Who was he? Why had he given her so much money? And why did she get the feeling that this wouldn't be the last time he walked through her door? Little did she know that stranger's visit would change everything. Emma couldn't shake the encounter from her mind. That stranger had been different. His expression, his words, the way he lingered. It felt as if he knew something about her, something she didn't understand. But as the days passed, she tried to push the thoughts away. There was always work to do. The bakery needed her full attention, and she couldn't afford to get lost in curiosity. Yet, the stranger returned. One evening, just as Emma was locking up, she heard a soft knock on the door. She turned, startled to see him standing outside, his dark coat blending into the dim light of the street. There was something unreadable in his eyes, something guarded yet urgent. Emma hesitated for only a moment before unlocking the door. "You're back," he nodded, stepping inside. "I need to ask you something." She crossed her arms, trying to steady herself. "All right." He glanced at the framed photograph again, the one of Emma and her grandmother. His expression shifted, almost like he was remembering something long buried. "Your grandmother, was her name Margaret?" Emma's breath caught in her throat. "How do you know that?" The man exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He looked around as if choosing his words carefully. She helped someone I knew a long time ago." Emma's heart pounded. Her grandmother had been known for her kindness, just like Emma. Over the years, she had given bread to countless people who had come through these doors, offering them warmth and dignity when they had nothing. But something about the way this man spoke, like it was personal, made her stomach twist. "Who?" she asked, barely above a whisper. He hesitated, then finally said, "Me." Emma's eyes widened. She had spent her childhood listening to stories of the people her grandmother had helped, but she had never imagined one of them would return like this. "You knew her?" He nodded slowly. "A long time ago, when I was just a kid." His voice was lower now, more distant. "I was homeless. My mother had passed, and my father, well, he was gone before I could even remember him. I had nowhere to go, no food, no shelter. I was just a boy wandering the streets, hungry every single day." Emma swallowed hard, picturing it. This man as a child, lost and alone, much like the people she still helped today. "One night, I collapsed right outside this bakery," he continued. "I was too weak to move, too cold to care what happened next. But then she found me, your grandmother." His lips pressed together for a moment, as if the memory was almost too much to say out loud. "She took me in. She didn't just give me food. She gave me hope. She let me sleep by the fire in the back, gave me fresh bread every morning, even found me clothes." He shook his head slightly. "She saved my life." Emma felt her throat tighten. Her grandmother had passed away years ago, and yet here stood living proof of the kindness she had left behind. "I owe everything to her," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But back then, I didn't know how to repay her. So, one day I just disappeared. I was afraid I'd be a burden. I thought if I left, I could prove to her that I could stand on my own." Emma didn't know what to say. She had always admired her grandmother's generosity, but she had never thought about the lasting impact it had on the people who had received it. She had never thought that one of them would return after all these years, standing before her now. The man exhaled sharply and looked at her, his expression suddenly filled with something else. Determination. "I never got to thank her, and now I can't." His hands clenched slightly. "But I can thank you." Emma's brows furrowed. "Me? You're continuing what she started," he said. "I see it. You're helping people the way she helped me, and I know what it's like to be on the other side." To be the one who's starving, who has nowhere else to go. He reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope, setting it on the counter between them. "This is for you, Emma's." Breath hitched. She could already tell by the weight of it that it wasn't just a few bills. She stared at the envelope, then back at him. "What is this?" His expression softened. "A way to keep this place running." Emma's fingers trembled as she picked it up and opened it. Inside was more money than she had seen in a long time. Enough to cover the bakery's expenses for months, maybe even longer. Her heart pounded. "I can't take this," she said quickly, pushing it back toward him. "It's too much." But he shook his head. "No, it's not." His voice was firm. "I was given a second chance because of this place. And I want to make sure no one else is ever turned away. I want to help the way she helped me." Emma's eyes stung with unshed tears. She had spent so long struggling, so long worrying about how she would keep the bakery open, and now a man from her grandmother's past had walked through her doors, carrying not just money, but a legacy of gratitude and kindness. But just as she opened her mouth to thank him, the bell above the door jingled. Another customer, or so she thought. When she turned, she froze. A second man had stepped inside. He was older, with graying hair and deep lines on his face. His clothes weren't ragged, but there was a sadness in his eyes, one that made Emma's stomach twist. And then, something happened that made her entire world tilt. The stranger beside her stiffened. His entire body tensed as he locked eyes with the man who had just entered. The older man's face went pale. His lips parted slightly, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "Son?" he whispered. The younger man's breath hitched, his hands clenching at his sides. For a long moment, no one spoke. The air between them was thick with something unspoken, something raw and painful. Emma barely dared to breathe. The man who had walked in didn't just know the stranger standing beside her. He was his father. The silence in the bakery was thick, stretching between them like an invisible wall. The older man's eyes were wide, searching, filled with something between disbelief and hope. The younger man, Emma's mysterious customer, stood frozen, his face unreadable, his jaw tight. Emma could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on all of them. She looked between the two men, her heart pounding. "Son?" the older man whispered again, taking a hesitant step forward. The younger man flinched at the word, as if it physically struck him. His hands clenched at his sides. His expression, unreadable, but his eyes held something deep and buried, pain. Emma had spent enough time helping those in need to recognize that kind of hurt. It wasn't just the pain of the past. It was the pain of abandonment, of feeling forgotten, of wondering why someone who was supposed to love you wasn't there when you needed them most. "I don't have a father," the younger man finally said, his voice quiet but sharp. The older man swallowed hard. "You do," he said, barely above a whisper. "You always have." Emma stepped back slightly, unsure if she should even be witnessing this moment. She had spent all this time wondering who this man was, why he had come to her bakery, what had drawn him here. And now it was all coming to the surface, in a way she had never expected. The younger man let out a bitter chuckle. "Really? Where were you then? Where were you when Mom died? When I had nowhere to go?" His voice cracked slightly, but he quickly masked it. "I waited. I looked for you. I begged for you to come back, and you never did." The older man's face crumpled with guilt. "I didn't know," he whispered. His hands shook as he reached forward slightly, as if afraid his son would disappear if he moved too quickly. "I left because I thought I was doing the right thing. I was young, I was scared, and I thought you'd be better off without me. He exhaled, his voice trembling. But I was wrong, and I have spent every single day regretting it. Emma felt her throat tighten. She knew what it was like to lose someone. She knew what it was like to carry regrets too heavy to bear. But she also knew that sometimes, no matter how much time had passed, a second chance could still mean something. The younger man turned away slightly, his breathing uneven. He didn't speak for a long moment. Then, without looking up, he murmured, "I don't know if I can forgive you." The older man nodded slowly, accepting the words with a deep sadness. "I understand." His voice was thick with emotion. "But I'm here now, and I'll keep showing up for as long as you'll let me." Emma didn't realize she was holding her breath until she exhaled softly. She had seen so much heartache in this bakery, but she had also seen healing. And in this moment, she saw something shift, something small but real. The younger man finally turned back, his eyes still clouded, but there was no anger left. Only exhaustion, only uncertainty, and maybe, just maybe, a tiny crack in the wall he had built around his heart. Emma knew this wasn't the kind of wound that healed overnight, but it was a start. The older man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. "This is my number," he said, setting it gently on the counter. "No pressure, no expectations. Just, if you ever want to talk." The younger man didn't take it, but he didn't push it away either. He simply stood there, staring at it for a long moment. And then, without another word, the older man gave a small nod and walked toward the door. The bell jingled softly as he stepped outside, disappearing into the cold night. Emma turned back to the younger man, her voice gentle. "Are you okay?" He let out a shaky breath, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know." He looked at the envelope of money still sitting on the counter, as if he had forgotten about it. Then, finally, he glanced at Emma. "Your grandmother. She taught me what kindness is, what it means to give, even when you have nothing." His voice softened. "And now, you're doing the same." Emma felt her chest tighten, warmth spreading through her heart. It's what she would have wanted. The man nodded slowly, then picked up the piece of paper his father had left. He didn't say anything, but Emma saw it. The tiny flicker of something in his expression. Maybe not forgiveness, not yet, but the possibility of it, and sometimes that was enough. As he turned to leave, he hesitated at the door. Then, glancing back at Emma, he gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Thank you," he said. Emma smiled back. "Anytime." And with that, he stepped out into the night, the paper still clutched in his hand. Emma stood in the quiet bakery, the warmth of the oven still lingering in the air. She thought about her grandmother, about all the people who had walked through these doors in search of something more than just bread. And she knew deep in her heart that kindness had a way of coming full circle.